Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, Staffing and Training a Cyber Incident Response Team, sponsored by Immersive Labs and broadcast by Informa. I'm Tim Wilson, editor of Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the Resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we'll ask you to complete our survey found at the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we'll be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. And now on to our presentation, Staffing and Training a Cyber Incident Response Team. We have a couple of great speakers here today on a topic that I think is very much at the forefront of a lot of enterprises today. Often we're approached about the issue of incident response with technology. People will sell you products and they'll give you that sort of thing. And we don't often talk about the people side of what it takes to run the incident response process. What kinds of people do you need? What does that process look like, and that sort of thing? And how do you train the folks that are be handling it for you? So today we have two great speakers to talk on that topic. Our first will be Gal Sponser. Gal has over 15 years of experience as an independent security professional and is a trusted advisor to CISOs of large corporations, technology and pharma startups, Ivy League University, and nonprofits and NGOs. He's currently working as a virtual CISO for a large organization right now. Since 2014, Gal has focused on emerging threats to availability as well as confidentiality, ransomware, and destructive attacks. He's been involved in multiple SANS Institute projects since 2002, including co-editing the SANS News Bites, revising the e-warfare course, and presenting on cyber stalking, CAPTCHAs, endpoint security, and hardware roots of trust. So that's Gal. You'll hear from him first. And our second speaker is Max Vetter. Max is the Chief Cyber Officer at Immersive Labs and also has over 15 years experience in cyber industry. Having studied astrophysics at university, he moved into a role at the Met Police targeting industrial and commercial crime. It was here that he also started exploring open source intelligence, which led to the dark web. He specialized in internet investigations into darknets and cryptocurrencies. He also taught at the GCHQ Summer School, educating students on reverse engineering and ethical hacking. So two great speakers today. We'll start off with Gal. He's going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to Max. But you can ask questions at any time during the session. So please don't hesitate. Keep the questions coming in, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. With that, Gal, I'll pass it over to you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I know everybody's busy doing blue team, red team, purple team, other team work, and I know taking an hour out of your day is appreciated. Hopefully you'll learn some from this content. Feel free to ask questions. We will see them as they come in, and we have some question time at the end. So I've been doing work here in security for about 20 years. It's been a while since I updated my resume with Tim, so I've been working with Dark Reading for a while now. Most of my customers have been CISOs, and I've been also doing CISO work myself. It's a lot harder than consulting to CISOs. I wonder how we do it sometimes. Looked at a different spectrum of customers, from startups to very large companies up to including Fortune 50, even single digits. So the spectrum of kind of resourcing and staffing, and there's definitely some patterns that emerge. We'll talk about some of them. And I'm not here to sell you products or managed services. I'm here as a kind of a facilitator for what I know about this space, and tell you what I think makes sense, and then we'll hear from other people. So the scope, again, assuming there's some blue team audience here and even red team might be helpful, we're looking to defend our org and help others do the same if you're vendors or consultants. So the main thing is about pre-breach preparation and a little bit about how we look at the people and process aspect. So understanding the attacker threat mindset is a big thing. We need to optimize defenses based on real world scenarios and real world capabilities of tools, and we'll talk about things like Mimikatz, for example. A lot of people in blue team inexplicably don't know a lot about vanilla kind of these days commodity tools that the bad guys use, and their threat model and the way they think bad guys operate and the capabilities of bad guys is certainly one of the things that I think we should look into as a prep for breach, because the capability space on the problem space, if you will, is so vast and interesting, and we are in many cases stuck in the past in terms of thinking we know what they can do, and they can do a lot more. What does that look like from a SOC point of view? You don't have to have a hard SOC with cool smoking mirror glasses and all that stuff, and sirens that go off. A SOC could be virtual. It could be one person doing all the work and then making a phone call. So when I say SOC, again, I know several people here are different levels of maturity, and that's fine. But the basic thing is how we understand what's going on from the early phase of the incident and across that life cycle. Other prep items, looking at communications, playbooks, documentation, et cetera. And the goals for today, we're looking at preparation, detection, analysis of the incident, and then how do we train the brain and integrate that into process. So this is Rich Mogul's breach triangle. He's a colleague from Securosis. He started Securosis. And the idea on Red Team is basically we want to take IP or PII, and we get to that data after an initial exploit of some sort. In some cases, that initial exploit is not very fancy. It could just be, say, an open S3 bucket somewhere, or a $C share on the internet. So we need to, quote unquote, exploit it and just find it, get to that data, and then we need to egress it. We need to actually grab it and move it around. Now, in the traditional IP PII sense, we need to egress it. In the ransomware sense, we don't. We just need to throw the grenade in the data center, and then we have a new customer who will pay us because they don't have backups. So that's one of the things that happens. In the blue team, we want to ideally prevent or disrupt that exploit initially. If we can't prevent everything, which we cannot, we need to disrupt access to the data from the initial exploit, which is usually called lateral movement and preparation for exfiltration, and then the exfiltration itself or the egress. IP and PII access is typically a little bit low and slow because they're trying to be sneaky, whereas ransomware, once they have staged the server-side stuff, we'll talk about that a little bit, it can take minutes, but up until that point, there's a lot of opportunity to work with. On the client side, definitely faster. It can just take one click onto a link or a attachment, and then it goes laterally into the server farm where the file servers and the payroll servers are, and that can be bad news. So again, exploit, get to the data, and potentially egress. In some cases these days, we're doing ransomware and also exfiltrating data for additional extortion goodness. This is our friend, This is Fine Dog. I started using this a few years ago, and it is certainly more relevant in 2020. Just ship it is part of why we're getting here for code quality. But basically, here are some free resources around incident response related standards and guidance. You may have seen this before if you've followed some of my other webinars. We have 861 R2, that's a Computer Security Incident Handling Guide, a classic. The Cybersecurity Framework itself, which talks about responding and recovering as one of the columns. The CIS has 6 free scenarios that have tabletop exercises, and SANS also has several incident handling checklists on their website. You can also go to the ISO and get a paid version of standard 27035, which has InfoSec Incident Management as the global standard. And here we have the cybersecurity framework, which includes identify, protect, and obviously detect, respond, and recover, which is the kind of life cycle of incidents. And that's, again, a free thing you can read and look into and incorporate into your data. Here's an example of that CIS tabletop exercise, 2 very good scenarios. One is a malware infection, very common, and the other is a cloud compromise. And so take these free resources, get your people, I would be tempted to say ice cream social, but not today. Nobody's getting together in the office these days. Do a virtual Zoom meeting or something like that and go through these once a month and document who knows how to detect this, what to do with the data once there's initial alert, who to call, and what is it that is to be done, and who can make those decisions. So in some cases, you might have to drop network connectivity on a LAN. Who can actually do that, and who can make the decision to allow that to happen because of the enormous business impact? And you better have your A game in terms of making that decision, because you don't want to high grade a scenario when it's not the correct thing to do, which is where we get into more visibility and logging and analytics to understand what's going on, so you don't have to over scope and overreact, right? But these are things that will help you to understand the gaps, and it takes months or even years to get to a certain level of maturity. These are just a couple of free examples. Another exercise: did you detect it, or were you notified of it? And here's where the people thing comes in. So there was a very famous political email hack in 2016. You may have heard of it. It was the DNC hack. And apparently the FBI called the DNC, and hey, they sent them to the IT guy, who was a little bit incredulous about the FBI calling him. And so they went back and forth, phone calls and emails. This is a documented New York Times story from a few years ago. And so someone was trying to notify them, hey, the bad guys are in your network getting your stuff. That didn't work out too well, because the process of validating both on the FBI side and the victim notification side was suboptimal, if you will, and the rest is history, literally. So we can have a NIDS, we can also have the newspaper intrusion detection system, and we need to understand what is it that our people would do. Are they trained to understand an external notification, how to handle that? There are a couple international standards about that. 29147, 30111. There's a security at email potentially. Is there a way for people to contact you? How would you handle this? So this goes to another tabletop exercise with your general counsel, with your incident response people, with your CIO, with your CFO potentially, because this may be an issue where they need to understand the impact to the public and maybe sell some shares, like some CFOs did recently after they had initial notification of a breach. Don't do that. The SEC frowns upon it. But seriously, this is a people and process thing. No amount of technology will help you with this. If Brian Krebs calls your people, or the FBI calls your people, and they're not taking it seriously, those millions of dollars spent on the cool sock stuff will not work. So this is actually a story. Brian Krebs did indeed call a city, a municipality, pre-ransomware, Florence, Alabama, and then bad things happened because that wasn't processed correctly. And again, the same thing with the FBI calling the DNC about the Russian hackers. By his own account, if you read the highlighted stuff here, he did not look too hard even after Special Agent Hawkins called back reportedly over the next several weeks. So that's interesting issues there around process and how do we get notified externally and internally. Communications, big stuff. So internally, we have to have the senior leadership, CEO and the board in some cases, the chief operating officer, kind of the internal CEO and the CFO, the money people and the ops people, general counsel, because everything is potentially underprivileged, although there's some drilling into that with the Capital One. If you want to Google Capital One legal privilege breach for your general counsels, show them that. There's definitely some process changes happening in the legal world around what privilege looks like and what it may not look like anymore in the near future. Certainly, obviously, the InfoSec and IT people with incident response, and then there's several other folks that may or may not need to know what happened. It's harder to hide things, obviously, from all the people when there is a ransomware event, and especially if you're a service provider with a ransomware event, like, for example, Garmin a month or so ago had an issue, and then, navigation systems for aircraft started getting wonky because the kneeboards with the iPads couldn't get updated. So depending on what your particular service is and who is consuming that service, you need to have a plan for understanding who would care and how would we notify them, and where is that legally permissible, legally mandatory, how fast do we have to notify them, etc. External, definitely a lot of this stuff gets handled with external counsel, and in many cases there's a digital forensics incident response firm that's often the technical lead under that external counsel. And then you get into clients, regulators, and in some cases the public and the press, which is, again, need to train people on how to deal with the press and the regulators and the clients, and make sure that they are only speaking about this and certainly speaking on behalf of the company if they are trained and authorized to do so. Because people get in trouble and cause more trouble just trying to be nice. So this is the capital one thing that we just talked about. Is the incident response report privileged or not? And the other privilege management, you need to understand internally what that actually means when you're doing an incident response, because people who have been affected by the incident in your org may try to sue you. And that's just life in the big city. So you need to understand with your GC, what does it look like? How are the communications going to happen through what platforms? Who is in scope? And how do we minimize the number and type of people that are involved so that you can try to retain that privilege, which is being eroded apparently. Not a lawyer, just play one on TV. Assume ownage of the corporate network. This is another process issue, and train your people to figure out how to use alternative communications, in some cases use code words to activate certain pre-planned plans in a drawer that they can take out and are not necessarily just emailed around in plain text. Paper copies, in many cases, due to ransomware and other events, paper copies are helpful. In some cases, people carry an encrypted USB key with all that stuff so they can access those things that have not been wiped by the ransomware. And you have to assume low bandwidth in many cases. Between DDoS, where multiple services are down, there's going to be issues. In some cases, DNS. It's always DNS. So much to do. So where do we start? Again, what kind of people, process, technology do I have available to me now? What do I know about my assets? And how are the people that are going to be involved in this, both on the IT and the security and the kind of operational side, general counsel and external folks, understand what this looks like and start drawing it out in flowchart. Who would want to do bad things to my assets, threat actors, and how do they do that? And this is where MITRE ATT&CK, previous pen test reports, study those and work with your people to do tabletops and work through, kind of tease out little work streams on the things we've already talked about. Another thing is, am I testing my inbound vendors with up-to-date TTPs, not just necessarily the questionnaires. Do some validation on your internal networks and, of course, your M&A targets, because you're buying risk with those approaches. And do I have a process to prioritize defensive measures? So if something is interesting that's happening, who can I train and who needs more training on the process and the communications channels and the tools that can help me get more data about the machines that are emanating interesting things. So this could be EDR, this could be antivirus, this could be network PCAPs, it could be cloud security, analytics tools. So all those things need to figure out who needs more training to do their job better and to be able to make better decisions. Is there a place for those people who do know what to do to look at the logs that once they get the information on the initial alerts potentially, can they get better context on what normal looks like and where this came from? Where upstream in time did this attack come from? Or is this not an attack, it's just a false positive in some way? And the more data they have access to and the ability to aggregate, store, retrieve, and analyze and enrich, how can we help them do that? And are they trained about in order to help with that? Do they have access to Intel feeds, not EADS, excuse me, logs in real time? How do I vet those sources and reduce false positives? So a little bit of metrics on where that stuff comes from. And this, again, a people and process issue, not as much a technology, because you can tune these things in many cases. If your people are doing this day to day, they'll be able to tell you where the problems are. So purple team, blue and red, happy together. We want to share information and work together so that red can walk us through a particular attack path, and the blue would see where we can potentially detect and where we can potentially prevent, or a little bit of both. In an ideal world, we prevent everything. In the real world, it's very hard to prevent everything because of the business impact of hard prevention. And so in some cases, we have to just detect and get a plan to respond to things that look weird or look wrong when they can't be prevented, and then iteratively use that to say, okay, this is it keeps happening more frequently. The impacts are serious. A peer company of ours in our size and sector have experienced this, and they gave us a readout. This is more of a high threat than we thought, the high risk, and so we might want to move that closer to prevention tower than just detection. Blue will see where the gaps are in initial detections and the process in which we get those detections and act on them, and then speed. Speed is a huge issue. If it takes you 5 hours or 5 days to do something that is only a 10-minute event, like say NotPetya or WannaCry, then you have a problem. You're way behind in terms of reactionary gap. You want to emulate a certain adversary group's TTPs. Check out the latest O-Day. Although O-Days are in many cases a distraction, keep your stuff patched and make sure you understand where bad things can happen through the previous things that we looked at. Understand where initial access is, and after the initial access, which you might have missed, figure out where the lateral movement are with, in many cases, just IT tools like PSExec and some hacking tools like Mimikatz that help you get a lot of good privileged credentials, which will then help them get way more data and access than you wanted them to, because they're now acting as God in your network. And then exfiltration, if you want to get funny, DNS encoding or other covert channels, those are all cool things to check out if you're on the higher end of the maturity scale, for example. So malware doesn't just materialize in our systems like Captain Kirk. It has to have specific threat vectors. A very popular one, browser links and exploit kits, email, obviously, the network worms, manual ransomware on the network once they have a position on the server and they're in the data center moving around, IM, SMS, apps and links, and then peer-to-peer torrent file sharing networks. Go through with your people and ask them, how are we inventorying all of these types of assets, aka threat vectors, and where are we good and where can we improve, and find validation for those statements from your people and give them training. Again, it doesn't have to be super expensive. Give them time to train and to rehearse and understand what's going on with these systems. More triangles. I love triangles. This is from a Microsoft person, malware hunt triangle. Rare binaries, you're inherently suspicious because they're so rare and we've never seen them before. There's pattern analysis. We're looking for tools that exist already and they're being abused. So things like PSExec, PowerShell, SMB, they're not malware, but they're used as malware after the initial compromise. And then there's kind of the easy stuff, which is off-the-shelf malware. There's just, hey, what is this? This is obviously bad. And in many cases, those are caught fairly quickly because they're used in many cases in commodity. Know your architecture. So is there someone in your company that is an IT architect that really understands how the networks and the apps and the databases and everything works? Get that person in and have them do a show and tell to your security team and get those people cooperating, because that is a huge gap between the CIO group and the CISO group and the CTO group. Those people should be working together quite a bit, kind of like red team and purple team, to understand how this stuff actually works. People don't always exploit security tools, although they do that as well, call Cisco. They, in many cases, abuse IT tools. And so how do we get to understand where the real IT and security nexus is? An example of that is Active Directory, probably the most important application you own, and we need to understand what identities are available for you to wrest back control over the administrative tier that manages all of those authentications and authorizations to do good and bad things on your network and your apps, your databases, and your servers, and your desktops. So have you looked into what would it mean for me to regain control over my network if someone actually had domain admin or some very highly privileged credential? These are very likely events because people mishandle those privileged credentials, and that's where you need to do some training on what does AD look like, how does the AD team administer it, and where does security help out in terms of understanding things like tier 0 and privileged admin workstations. Root cloud accounts are very similar. Never use the root cloud account to administer things. It's only to break glass to get control back of your network and to create the initial landing zones, if you will. Is threat intelligence a breach prep? Sure. Where can we look at that? So Chris Cochran from Netflix Threat Intel and Ops Director, he gave a training at a SANS Summit earlier this year. He called it the easy button. So elicit the requirements, assess the collection plan, strive for impact, and yield to feedback. So it's a little bit of a OODA loop or plan, do, check, act, understand what people need, and how do we get there. So those are things that are around threat intelligence to understand where we should focus our time and our priorities and customize this to your sector, to your size, and to your maturity, and to your, say, 1, 2, 3, 5-year goals of where your senior leadership are trying to take you in terms of CIO, CISO, CFO, CLO, and where is it that you're trying to make an impact in your sector. So understand what is it that people want from you, and consume and customize your threat intelligence for that. Don't just go by every feed. Although there's so many feeds, get the ones that make sense for you. Ask your friends and family in the industry, especially size and sector and maturity, and you will have a good time. Some sources of threat intelligence for more training and awareness and the process is integration of these types of sources, both internal and external. External can be free, external can be proprietary and very costly in some cases, but I think you should start with your own network and some free intel, understanding what is it that is actually happening in your network and what is happening on your sector. So ISACs are sector specific by definition. Go there and understand and start using those as the process for integrating these feeds, integrating these enhancements and enrichments into the scope of what is this potential alert, which becomes an incident, which potentially we're trying to prevent from becoming a breach. Overcollection is the thing. You have a lot of false positives, poor intel value. This is where you start trimming and looking at the kind of the bonsai tree of threat intelligence. And this is part of that larger integration and process where you're going to get your people to understand what's going on. Prepare for the common attacks. Simulate the bad, stitch the logs together into patterns, and you'll be able to see things for better detection and almost signature. Like if you see this and then that and this other thing, that means they're trying this particular tactic. Understand that engineering is not sufficient. You have malice versus flaws, and how do we balance protection versus detection? This is an example of a mind share in terms of graph versus list thinking, and we'll look at a couple of those things. So graph thinking, in terms of red, I want local admin, and I want domain admin ideally. So I find one machine, I dump the creds with Mimikatz, so I can read plain text. Even if you created a new 60 character credential this morning, I can get that from RAM decrypted in LSASS with something like Mimikatz. If you don't know what Mimikatz is, you need to know what Mimikatz is. It completely changes the nature of the game in terms of privileged credential management. Because most networks have identical local admin credentials, even if they don't have a domain admin, they just have the local domain, the local admin on your box, they might as well have a skeleton key to that particular network, to all the servers or all the desktops that are administered with that local admin. So in your training, in your mindshare, ask a very specific question. Do we have something like Microsoft Labs to treat this issue? If not, definitely get yourself out there and look into that. And there are also commercial products for that. On the blue side, move towards unique local admin on each box using something like Labs. It's free with Active Directory, and jealously define your domain admin credentials. Example, never use domain admin to administer servers and desktops. Understand your graph. What does that mean? This is an example of Mimikatz on a terminal server for remote access. Somewhere in that graph, there's a high value asset which has access to the actual domain controller. And there's a posting to that blog. In the close-up below of that, you can see that U1 on the bottom there has access, in the green person labeled U1 has access to high-value asset. So we don't necessarily have direct access to him, but we will lily pad our way to that person's desktop and grab credentials from him. So here's an example of thinking and training and get your people thinking this way and integrating this into your process, graph versus list thinking. So if you look at the output here of something called the Bloodhound, which is a graph database fed tool that allows you to see derivative local admin rights. So the number of explicit admin rights is 5, but because you have access to that entire graph and you can lily pad, you can get 335 derivative admins. And that's something that is the reality of computer security. Definitely familiarize yourself with the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It goes all the way from initial access to command and control exfiltration. These are various ways to take a look at a scenario of reading your email. So back to training and understanding how does this actually happen? What does this look like on my network and using my tools, and where are my blind spots that I need to buy or purchase or just integrate some freeware into if you have the IT talent, or you can get some consultants to stitch that together for you. So red team wants to find a lower value business account or breach password dump, many of those around, replay those credentials as a corp account. So if you had joeblow@hotmail.com breached and you use that as your joeblow@corp.com, they may be able to replay those, and now they're you. So they then read and write the email traffic, and they're actually a legit user. How do we find that? We monitor threat intel on our users and who has been dumped, and then get obviously MFA on email, password managers, but also audit on the server side anything that looks like a rule of forwarding or auto-delete of phish, hack, malware. That is an example of things that are artifacts on the email server or Office 365 that says, I'm in your server and I don't want your people to report phishes and hacks to the security people. This is an example of a excellent, this is John Lambert again, looking at what is reading email. And email is really about the central repository for identity, because in many cases you get an email account compromised, and then you really get all the other accounts that get password resets into that email. They click the link and create a new password. Unless you have MFA, it's a little bit harder. So this is great stuff. And again, you have access to the entire PowerPoint, so I'm going to breeze through this. Please read it later. This is our friend from the movie Airplane. If you're super young, go take a look at it. It's funny. Came out about 40 years ago. This is ransomware. I want to destroy your company. Maybe that's my goal. So similar to ransomware, but I just don't care. I don't accept payment. And I don't decrypt. So this happened to Sony. It happened to Saudi Aramco. It happened to a bunch of other places. What does Blue Team do about someone who wants to destroy us? We have to segment the network via the network and identity planes. We talked about Active Directory, privileged password credentials. Make sure you have offline backups. Make sure they're actually offline, and then check again and ask existential questions like, can I build my entire AD infrastructure from scratch? Do I have a backup server in the closet that's offline that could serve as a root for that? And how is my DRBCP playbook relevant to getting nuked? Because this is a DRBCP issue. And so that, again, back to training and process and integrating the right people on the executive side and the IT side and service providers. I want to get in your dev environment. There are all kinds of ways to do that. For example, you scan GitHub repos for secrets, and then you go in and you impersonate people as services. AppSec fails of yore. This still happens, actually. In 2002, we had an InfoSec dumpster fire where people who coded the website of a public company from Sweden called Intentia, they were releasing their quarterly kind of SEC-like market information, and someone figured out from Reuters that they were just incrementing the numbers to the URL as opposed to randomizing them, and they ended up figuring out that I can read the pre-release quarterly statement and write a story about it. They got sued, and all kinds of silly things happen. Now, that certainly wouldn't happen again. Of course it did, because old funds never die. It's a ratchet effect. But this actually happened to First American Financial, publicly traded about a year ago, and Brian Krebs wrote the story. So this similar vector. So understand basic AppSec. Who in your environment is integrating or producing code from third parties and on-prem with an SDLC? Do they understand Web AppSec at all, or AppSec for mobile devices, etc.? These things still happen, even in companies where it shouldn't. Old funds never die. You get an email from a company with a link, it goes the digits up and down the URL. Now you can read stuff, okay? So that's what happened there. And putting it all together, the traditional SOC approach is changing. So a lot of people in a SOC today are still clinging to the model of the layer 3 stuff, where you have a lot of decryption going on, you have a lot of network hardware, you have a lot of old kind of crunchy perimeter, and so many tools are only about the packets and the flows. And that's fine, but since COVID, everybody is doing remote access, less people are on VPN and moving towards zero trust, more people are going to software as a service. All these things directly affect the availability of the wetware to be useful in 2020 going forward. How do we replace, for example, the swivel chair comms that were in a physical SOC before, whereas today it has to be through things like Slack or voice or chat or things like that. So those are training and people process aspects, not so much tooling. So what are the staffing models and ratios look like? FTE versus consulting, those are all things you need to look at. And what does it mean to be either 24/7 or tiered, and how do we get shift overlaps? There is, during an incident, in some cases, people are going to be stretched to the breaking point and really not able to help out. So you need to get people to understand what's going on. 1 second, my cat actually, there we go. Sorry about that. So the process, guided execution towards goals of detection and containment. So how do we integrate and automate? So a lot of your people understand big hardware and big network. Get them to really understand how to integrate these things in terms of coding, in terms of integration, and a lot of scripting. Scripting is absolutely critical as a knowledge area in the SOC, because otherwise you get into all these kinds of crazy silos and nobody sees the big picture. It's very difficult to integrate without that kind of people wetware skill. Obviously, data engineering is I'm a big fan of that. Data engineering is basically the plumbing of how to get the logs and the visibility you need into the various analytical tools. And so you can buy some of this stuff, a SOC in a box, and in some cases you need to build it yourself because your needs are so mature and so exotic and so big, there's issues with that. So if you Google Netflix Keystone project, that was their first big data engineering project that included things like Apache Kafka, which allows you to have a inbound and outbound producer-consumer model. Huge thing in the SOC right now. So big data and data engineering are big training areas that your folks should be aware of now. Large SOC org chart. This is an example, and we don't all need that. Some of these competencies, this again from MITRE, has a book called 10 Strategies of the SOC. They're a call center, they do incident analysis, they're at Intel, they do some of the pen testing, certainly admin all the security tools, and in some cases do that engineering, which is basically scripting and integration. This is an example of capability size maturity model. This is table 7, page 80 in that book, and you have various capabilities with virtual SOC, small, large, or national. And just take a look at that either from the slides and or read the book. This is an interesting thing where your staffing is an issue of what is it that I'm trying to do. So people sometimes say if I get more staff, I'll be able to be more productive, or if I get a SIM, I'll be able to be more productive. And the perception is if you get a SIM, for example, you will need less people. And that is true at some point in the future, but until then, you actually need more staff. So understand the requirement for staffing and their skill sets. Automationizing the monitorization. This is a quote from the Work Smarter, Not Harder on the MITRE book. Definitely need to understand what does it mean to offer comprehensive, effective monitoring analysis. You have to get that automation, and a lot of that automation comes from having the right telemetry from the right tools, looking in the right places, but also stitching all that together so you can understand what's going on in the big picture, and that's that engineering part. Skip a couple things. Build or buy, definitely a training and a wetware scenario. How do we understand which tools are best for us? If you have a lot of open source experts in your CTO and CIO group, bring them in to this project and help them explain to you where they can integrate a lot of open source tools and freeware. And obviously this is fraught with risk, but so is some of the vendor space out there. Organize your sources in terms of understanding where people get stuff, and this is a list of each of the sources, and then get things like rates and volumes to understand the size of this thing. Where do we put them? Do we put them in an S3 raw layer first and then analyze them, and then we put some of that as an output into the SIM, or do we just pretend we're bazillionaires and have no budget limits and send everything to the SIM, which I discourage. Get the routes to the boxes. This is, again, a data engineering, people who know how to move logs and get logs from point A to B. And you go from this to something like this. I use FluentD as an example, and it is, again, another skill set relating to an open source tool like FluentD that is very helpful to people who are doing containers and other application monitoring, and in some cases need to send multiple sources to multiple places, not just one SIM. So there we go. I'm going to skip a couple things. Sorry about that. So back to where we were here. This is the big picture. reduce the number of exploits, make it harder for them to get to the data, and make it hard for them to egress once they're there. Thank you.
Thanks, Gal. There's a lot of material here, and I just want to remind everybody, you can download the slides using the resources widget. You can also rewatch this presentation. You'll get a link after this session. You'll get a link that you can watch it on demand. There's so much to cover here, Gal, and I really appreciate the fact that you tied together not only the tools and the people piece of incident response, but also some of the threats that are happening right now, which is, it's just really helpful. So thank you very much for that. We're going to take questions and answers here at the end, so please keep them coming. I've got a few already. But right now I want to introduce Max Vetter again from Immersive Labs. Immersive is doing some really interesting things on the side of sort of helping your team get trained, get up to speed on that kind of thing. So Max, why don't I turn it over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. Yeah, my name is Max Vetter. I'm the Chief Cyber Officer. As Tim's introduction said, previous life in law enforcement and intelligence, and previously with GCHQ, which is the US version of the NSA. I was teaching there the cyber school. So everyone going into GCHQ, we would teach a pre-course for them to get them upskilled. While I was there, I met Immersive Labs CEO, James Hadley, and what happened while we were there, we saw kind of the issues and problems that a lot of classroom training presents when it comes to cybersecurity. And so James left and set up Immersive Labs, and here we are 3 years later. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is why, a bit about training. What is training for? Because we're talking about staffing and training of the incident response. So why do you need training, and why do you need staffing for incident response? Well, when it comes to incident response, obviously it's to try and mitigate bad things happening, or at least to try and stop them if you can, or try and mitigate any fallout from them. And so training isn't about spending 5 days out of the office, or it's not about potentially getting a certification. And now certifications can be good if they're, I consider they're good if they're practical, but they're only a snapshot in time. So they only demonstrate your skills when you actually do the certificate. Now, there are lots of certificates out there where it's kind of multiple choice questions. So what that certificate shows is you're good at answering multiple choice questions. It doesn't necessarily show that you're good at your job in incident response. And so all this goes together where, what we came up with is a different way of thinking of things, which is more about your human cyber readiness. So that's what you want. You don't want people necessarily going to training courses. You don't want even staffing, even getting people in. It's actually about making your humans ready to deal with any cyber problem. And we're looking at this in 3 E's: equipping, exercising, and evidencing. So what do you want to do with those people? Firstly, we equip them. So you want to coach them to get them upskilled on any subject. We have over 800 labs within our platform. These are practical labs which will take you from anything from cyber fundamentals up to incident response, log analysis, all the way to reverse engineering, threat hunting as well. And so what happens is we'll coach people on a tool or technique, and then make them demonstrate that they have that aptitude through our labs. And this will make sure that you can, at that point, prove that they have the skills that they need for the job that they're doing. Because that's the other thing is training is not relevant unless it's teaching your people the skills they really need to do when they're actually in their job. We do find in academia and everything, they're very, very red team heavy. Now, there are red teams out there a lot, obviously, but what we find is blue team is often lacking in terms of, especially in universities and training courses as well. And I talked to a academic about this, and he actually said to me once, "Oh, well, why would you do blue teaming? Because that's really boring. Red team is much more fun," which kind of gives you the perspective of that academic anyway. And so what we need to do is upskill the people on the job, on the tools and the techniques that they need for a job. And so we do this through equipping, through our coach and demonstrate. And then move on to the second E, which is exercising. So you want to exercise your people in the as real as possible. So we have our cyber crisis simulator, which will simulate a real attack. So, and this goes from the board to the incident response team. So from the board's perspective, we want to know big questions like, do you pay the ransom or not? And from the incident response, it's, do you take those computers down? How do you do the malware analysis? How do you deal with that? Do you find the indicators compromised? And then also we have challenge labs, which will do a variety of things like CTFs and take people through scenarios in a realistic environment to actually test them against what would happen if there was a real attack, rather than just dealing with, I don't know, a vulnerability from 2004 or something. You're actually dealing with real vulnerabilities that are timely and relevant. And then the third part of that is evidencing. So as our system, you can track what people are doing, where they're getting stuck. If they can demonstrate their skills, they can move on to a different area and obviously score how prepared they are for dealing with those. And that's from the board all the way down to the cybersecurity team. And so you bring that all together, and that essentially is how we are looking at making your humans more cyber ready. And I'll just show you a little bit how we can do this. We align all our labs to the MITRE ATT&CK and NIST frameworks. So again, we're trying to develop your human potential with the equip side, and then we're trying to battle test people using real labs, real tools and techniques, and then evidence that so you can see your human capability, whether it's you personally or your team, or from the exec position, the whole organization. And then this is a good example of one of our labs. This is one of the demonstrate labs in the AlkStack series. So we have a series of coach labs teaching your users everything from everything they need to know about AlkStack. And then at the end of that series, they have to demonstrate that against a investigation on a real infected device that is emulates a real attack as much as possible. And once they can only pass that if they either have the prerequisite practical skills they need, or if they've done all the coach labs before it. So this is a way of proving people both have those practical skills and that they can evidence them to you, their boss or the manager or whoever, that they have those skills, and you kind of know that they're in a place that they can help in any attack. And so what we then put, there are all these coach series, and then we put them together into roles. So if it's a SOC role, we'll have a number of different tools and techniques that go up to make that whole role. And so you can move through, depending on where you are, whether it's in tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 in a SOC, for example, or intermediate advanced pen testers, or threat hunting and incident response. And as I mentioned earlier, we have aligned all our labs to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And so this is the manager view you see here, so you can see all the labs that are aligned to the different techniques. Again, as Gore was saying earlier, you want to understand exactly what you're most at risk for. And the MITRE ATT&CK framework is really, really good for this if you get to know it really well, if you're in an incident response team. And then you can pick the tools and the techniques that are particularly of interest to you, and then through here you can link to labs that will upskill you and coach you on those particular tools, and then your manager can see who has done them as well. We actually had an occasion where a customer had a live incident, and they found the person who had done all the labs on that technique that they're looking at, and then got them involved in the actual incident. And the other side to this is the problem with training typically, when I was writing courses, is the first time you deliver a course, it's 6 months out of date. So, relevance and speed of change is the problem there. As I said, you don't want to be looking at a vulnerability in 2004 Windows XP or something. So we get our labs on the platform with any major new malware or vulnerability happening. We'll get a lab on the platform within days, typically within 24 hours, but we try and depends on the complexity of that vulnerability. And so this will again, all aligned to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. This will keep your teams ready for any attack and really kind of upskilling them on something, hopefully before it even hits your network. So that's how we kind of view our version of getting your human cyber ready. And yeah, happy to take any questions about that. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Max. Just while we're talking about what you all do, we have one quick question about whether or not you could change the scenario in what you just described. Can you sort of set up the training to work in different scenarios?
Yeah. So the cyber crisis simulator is very much customizable. So we have our team that work with incident response teams, and we have a kind of set of templates, but then a lot of them are customized to individual customers, because the feedback we've got is this isn't relevant if you're just talking about a different industry and a different company. So yeah, the customizable is part of that whole process, definitely.
Fantastic, thank you. So let's push on to the kind of the broader Q&A. As a reminder, if you want to participate in the Q&A, just type your question into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we're not able to answer all the submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with our speakers who can reply to you offline. I'll also direct your attention to our webinar survey available on the right of the presentation window. If you close the survey, you can reopen the widget by clicking on the icon along the bottom of your screen. Thanks in advance for filling out the feedback form. So one of the questions that we had, guys, had to do with the cloud. Both of you did a great job talking about sort of incident response and the team and the training and that kind of thing. So many of our audience here is working with cloud and cloud service providers and that kind of thing. Can you, both of you, maybe talk a little bit about how does the cloud service provider sort of factor into this? And, when you're talking about incident response, does your team work with theirs, or, how do you train your folks on what their cloud service providers are doing? That kind of thing. Maybe, Gal, you could start us off.
Sure. I think the interesting thing about cloud is that for some reason there's still a discussion about is it secure or not, and I think that's the wrong answer. It's secure in a different way. I think it's easier to secure it if you know what you're doing and you have the right people, and certainly not harder to secure than all the on-prem legacy cruft, which is unpatchable and very difficult to control these days as well. So I'm a big fan of security in the cloud and cloud security. And certainly you can look at things like one of the big places to look at cloud security is storage. So if you have all your sensitive data backed up, say, in a bunch of S3 buckets that expire to Glacier to reduce costs, make sure you have people who understand what does the S3 access model look like, and what does identity and access management look like in Amazon, for example. I'm not picking on Amazon, Azure, GCP, similar thing. So it's a question of, does the technology match the skill set? And the typical risk for that is going to be an inadvertently open S3 bucket, or someone has passwords or API keys that are sitting out there in the open, or the accounts don't have MFA and there's some credential that is stuffed. So if you look at some of these cloud breaches, quote unquote, the cloud was not breached. It was the controls that the cloud provider gave you were not properly implemented. And much of that is about training and process, right? So that's an example.
Yeah, I'd agree with Gal on that. It's the DevOps people or Sec DevOps, or bridging that gap between the incident response and the knowledge within DevOps as well, because obviously that's security in a different environment is sometimes not known by the incident response people. So that is a whole different area that you kind of need to bridge that gap, where the same with the developers, right? If they're writing insecure code, they need to be trained as well as the cybersecurity team and the DevOps, and that's becoming more and more important now because cloud is becoming so much more ubiquitous.
Thanks, Max. While you're sort of have the floor here, we had a question about the simulation and the scenarios that we were talking about before, and the question has to do with how long does it take to go through a particular scenario. Can you give us a sense for what's involved there and how long does it take?
Yeah, so there's a few different options. So depends if you're talking about the practical incident response side of things, or if it's from the board perspective, which is more of a essentially digital tabletop. Digital tabletops, the point about our platform is it's cloud-based and can spin up anywhere. And obviously, with the thing we're dealing with COVID, your C-suite may not be able to get together to do tabletop exercise. So it's basically a digital version of that. It's up to the users generally who are writing them, but they can be from anything from a normal tabletop, which would be an hour or two, but we can also run asynchronously. So you can have it running over a few weeks where different members of the team will come back and answer different parts of the scenario. So it's more kind of up to you. Generally, when it comes to the practical labs are between kind of 15 and an hour each, but a number of them will make up a scenario as well.
Great. Okay, thank you. Broader question. We had a member of the audience ask about third-party code. It says, what about third-party code running on your digital infrastructure? What are your thoughts on that? Third-party code gets compromised often and eventually can affect your properties. Do you have thoughts about how organizations from an incident response point of view should approach that? Is that something that happens more on the app dev side, or is that something that your incident response team should be paying attention to? Y'all, maybe you want to start on that?
I'll punt that.
How about you?
Yeah, I mean, similar to the cloud things, it's like your incident response team. I think the incident response team is always looking out for the vulnerabilities, right? Any latest vulnerabilities. We have, in our company, we're quite lucky because we have a big team of pen testers who are writing labs anyway. But we will see vulnerabilities come out in the code that we've used, and then have to get over to the engineering team pretty quick and escalate that. So it's I wouldn't say it's the job of the incident response team, but because they're doing it most of the time anyway, there definitely needs to be some crossover there of them understanding the code that is being written and the third-party code that is used because they do it all the time. And obviously, the coders themselves need to understand vulnerabilities as well. So I wouldn't say there's one. It depends on the size of the organization. But yeah, the incident response team, if they understand the third-party code that is being used, they're sometimes a good group to flag to the developers. But that obviously can't always happen depending on the size of the organization.
We have time for one more question. I'm going to steal it for myself. We only have a couple of minutes to answer a really big question, but as we're talking about incident response teams and people and skill sets, what in your opinion are the most important skill sets that you need as you're evaluating people and training them? What are some of the key things that our audience should look at? Max, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think what we're finding, and having talked to a number of CISOs, the whole idea of a CV and a skill set is not necessarily what they're looking for anymore. And I think it's more things like perseverance. You know, if you can stick at something, no matter what it is, there's so many tools out there and there's so many new vulnerabilities and everything coming out all the time. If you're a very tool-driven person and you can't think of anything outside that, you can maybe have a job, but you're not going to be one of the key people. So perseverance and being able to kind of speed of change and good at, quick at learning, I think are the key kind of attributes of someone in an incident response team.
Yeah, I think, emotional patience, which is another word for perseverance, I guess. The bureaucracy of any corporate, government, whatever network trying to fund these types of activities as a proactive measure, especially in resource-constrained euphemism for budget slashing of 2020 in many cases, is really very difficult. So persevere, explain to people how this applies to them. This is really about communications to leadership, if that makes sense for your role, and be excellent at what you do so that people will take you seriously and you get that credibility internally and are able to explain things so that people will trust you and give you the resources you need, or in some cases, again, understand how it's just about stitching together, in some cases, open source stuff. And, it's okay to not have the latest and greatest commercial tools. Start with some of the communications processes. Those are free. Spend the time. And then once things get moving, you'll have to move from spreadsheets to something else. And definitely get more training and more discussions with your peers in the industry, all part of perseverance.
Fantastic. Well, I have more questions, and maybe the audience does too. If you have a question that didn't get answered, we will follow up with you over email. So please, if you didn't get your question answered, please be confident that we'll come back to you. I want to thank Gal and Max. I got a lot out of today's presentation, and I hope our audience did too. I'll also want to thank to our sponsor, Immersive Labs, as well as to everyone in the audience. We appreciate your attention and participation. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been able to listen to the event. This webinar is copyright by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Immersive Labs, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinion. On the behalf of our guests, Immersive Labs, and Informa, I'm Tim Wilson. Thanks for your time and have a great day.